All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So welcome everyone. My name is Megan Hancock. I am the senior curator at the Denison Museum. And in celebration of Say It Loud Stop at the Denison Museum, we are pleased to welcome tonight's featured speaker, Kimberly Drew, author of Black Futures, who will speak about curation and the preservation of Black life online and in the form of publications. Tonight's talk is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation. The Denison Museum is a teaching museum on the campus of Denison University in Granville, Ohio. In spring of 2020, the museum opened Say It Loud from the collection of Hedy, Fischer, and Randy Shull. The exhibition includes the work of world-renowned contemporary Black artists who document, and challenge historical perspectives and events. The show illustrates the struggles and achievements of African Americans with themes focused on ethnic identity, institutional racism, gender, and beauty. The works on view came from an array of Guggenheim, Whitney, and MoMA artists, including Kehinde Wiley, Obama's official portraitess, Kerry James Marshall, Allison Sarr, Trenton Doyle Hancock, Michelin Thomas, Hank Willis Thomas, and Sanford Biggers. Kimberly Drew is an art curator and writer. She formerly worked as the social media manager for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was the keynote speaker at the American Alliance of Museums in 2019. She is well known with her social media handle, Museum Mammy. Drew's first book was released in June 2020, This Is What I Know About Art, and recently just released Black Futures with New York Times writer Jenna Wortham on December 1st. You can learn more about the Denison Museum and Say It Loud on our website, www.denison.edu/museums. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Drew. Thank you.
I'm so sorry, just as you were wrapping up, my dad is calling me. So I'm just gonna put him aside for a moment. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I know adding another Zoom stop to your agenda is a really hard thing to do. And so I appreciate you all sitting with me digitally, holding space with me digitally. I think that in these moments, it's so hard not to be able to be in the same room and really connect. And I think this migration to digital is, of course, difficult in that way, but also beneficial in others. And I can talk through a bit of that in terms of my own career trajectory as we go along with today's conversation. I think that everyone has access to the chat. So if you guys want to pop in any questions at any point in the chat, please do. I know that this is being recorded for future viewing. So for anyone who's watching in the future, I'm sorry, you won't be able to participate in the chat. But I think that the chat function in Zoom makes it a little bit more human and makes it so that you're not just watching another thing on YouTube. So I'll share my screen, which I realize is a tech level that I'm not like always at. And so please work with me if I show you something wild. I think I can show my whole desktop. Yes. Oh, wow. Look at me go. Okay. So this is a lecture that I've amended quite a bit over time, but there's a few like key staples, which I'll point out because I think they're just important to me. I put this first image, which is a Michelin Thomas image. It is not the image that's in the exhibition, but Michelin is an artist that's near and dear to my heart because she was one of the first Black artists that I really learned of once I had started my education on Black artists. I'd learned about her work during an internship at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which I did in 2010. And learning that Michelin was also from New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, also queer, identified, and then also using both representation and abstraction to really highlight some of the beauties and difficulties in Black life. I was always really drawn to Michelin's work, so I chose to put Michelin's work here on this first slide. Because this is a teaching museum and of course going to the Denison community, I want to start with this portrait of me that was taken by a friend on the day of my graduation from Smith College, where I graduated in 2012. I love to look at this picture of myself, one, because I look so stressed to myself. I know I don't look super stressed here, but there was so much that I didn't know would be coming. I didn't have a secure plan for the future. And I think for any of the students who are on this call, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And of course, it's complicated even more by the fact that we are all in this exact moment surviving a global health pandemic. But I always like to start here because I feel like it's important to remember where you've come from in your journey. Like there's so much career advice I think anyone can give you. And there's so many goals that I think we individually hold, personal and professional. And as you continue to succeed or fail or grow or anything like this, it's really important, I think, to continue to look back at the version of yourself that maybe would have never gotten as far as you did, even in the failures, or the version of yourself that even in the greatest success would be just like, wow, I can't believe that this person, 10 years from now is me. And I think that 2012 version of myself would be like shocked and amazed. But at the same time, I've always tried to stay true to this version of myself that was a museum educator at the time, that was really curious at the time, and was really interested in making sure that I was utilizing social media and the internet to the best of my ability to learn more about art, and specifically Black artists. So I mentioned in 2010, I did an internship at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which I'll get more into in a bit. But this quote is one that also always has stuck with me. It is a quote from Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who founded Negro History Week, which would go on to become Black History Month. And Dr. Woodson said, if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. And I really love this quote because one, it's like very extreme. The thought of extermination, I think, is an urgency that we all should be moving with, especially when thinking about archiving, cataloging, collecting, and display. What's at stake in the work that you're doing? Because there's not the most glory when you're working in museums. There's not the most glory when you graduate with an art history degree. The glory really is found in resisting erasure, in being in finding the thing that you're most passionate about, and making sure that you're contributing to the scholarship of it, or contributing to the ways that people access the scholarship to it. And I don't think that can be overstated enough. I think there's a lot of even like Obama at one point was like, what's the point of an art history degree? And I think for me, it's this exact sentiment, is that we want to make sure that these brilliant ideas, these connective tissues, the ability for artists to help us really wayfind, whether that be graphic design or literally wayfind, whether that be work by artists like Michelin Thomas or Hedy, or these illustrious set of artists who are in this exhibition, who really help us to see the world more clearly, and might even in their own work, especially thinking about Hank, he has a project called Four Freedoms, thinking about navigating the world on a broader kind of structure and thinking about tackling major injustices in the world. Artists, unlike maybe scientists or artists who are scientists, they have this incredible ability to build a blueprint, build a roadmap for us forward. And so I always think about resisting erasure and the potential for extermination, especially in a time like this one. There's just so much loss of this year. What do you want future generations to know and have access to is a big question I think we all should be asking each other. So as I mentioned, I was an intern at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 2010. That's really where all of my journey began. I think that there's a lot of conversation, especially this year, about the importance of institutions, whether or not they're still relevant. Museums as an inherently colonial structure, do we still need them? And there's a lot to be said about that. But I, to my bone, root, and core, am an institutional person because of the experience that I had at Studio Museum. I just confidently know that without the opportunity of being within that institution, I wouldn't have the same kind of fire that I have in terms of, especially when I was at the museum, I was 19 years old, I didn't have any level of confidence. I didn't know many Black artists. And it was being in that institution, walking through that foyer, seeing Timothy, who worked at the desk, seeing Miss Sheila, who worked in the museum store, and knowing that she would direct me to the resources that I needed, or going upstairs and working directly in the office of Thelma Golden as her intern. It was those kind of like cosmic connections that I think really cemented, especially in the earliest parts of my career, that I wanted to be working within museums. I think, like I said, I say that completely aware that there is a lot more to be said about museums. I've worked at even more problematic museums, which I'll get to later. But for me, I just know confidently, like if I was trying to do it independently, it just wouldn't have been the right terrain for the way that my brain works. Like I'm a structured person. I really need structure. I really need access to archives that are organized, so that I can then take these structures that pre-exist and remix them and make them in my own image, or figure out the things that might be relevant to other people. And I think it's equally important for this ecosystem of art and for exhibitions like this one to even happen and exist, for there to be people who play all these different roles. But I only say that with the conceit that I just so happen to be an institutionally minded, oriented human. This poster that is on display here, with the yellow background and it says Palladium at the top, is a show poster for a Andy Warhol and Basquiat exhibition that happened in, I think 85, yeah, in 1985. And before seeing this poster, I was like maybe on a lunch break, which is how I tell the story, but probably not on a lunch break, and just kind of like scrolling through Tumblr during my internship at the Studio Museum, and saw Andy Warhol and was like, okay, I know who this person is. I mean, Andy Warhol is definitely one of those like more household name artists. And then I was like, who is this Black guy? Like, who is this person that he's interacting with? I want to know more about him. And like any good millennial, I started doing my good Googles and was immersed into this world of incredible paintings and incredible artwork. And my first instinct when I discovered this work was just kind of like, okay, where has this been? You know, why didn't I learn about this artist in my art history classes? Why hadn't I learned about this person just like in lay experience around in the world? And I wanted to, at that very moment, make sure that other people knew who Basquiat was, and other people knew who artists like Glenn Ligon or Lorna Simpson or Carrie Mae Weems might be, no matter what their kind of background is. But I felt it was really important to make sure that these artists, especially like if they know each other intimately enough to be showing together, they're contemporaries. And, you know, art history is built so much on these kind of like connective tissues. And so how can we make sure that not only do these names end up in like the annals of history and art history, but also as part of a conversation in pop culture. So after my internship ended, I went back to campus, like all good students do. And I immediately was like, okay, I want to be in an art museum. I want to be an art history major. I, at the time, had been studying, I think, engineering, and dropped all those classes and was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And I started taking all these ridiculous things like survey of Asian art, Baroque painting. I took some like Flemish and Dutch artworks, like was really into the orgies, was really like, okay, this is kind of cool. But I wasn't really seeing a lot of the artists or artwork that I wanted to be seeing, which I think is an experience for many. And it happens. I mean, I don't know exactly why it happens infrastructurally. I think a lot of universities really do need to think about a more diverse set of educators that can really bring in an expertise on so many of the world's different cultures. But the way that my university structure was set up was just a very Eurocentric kind of vision. And it was a very, very, very ancient heavy, like there was only one contemporary art class. And in that contemporary art class, you weren't seeing people of color really. And so anyway, in the interest of, you know, finding more of those artists, and then also really privileging the experience that I'd had at the Studio Museum, I reached out to my friend Marcellus, who's in the screenshot here, one of the dear loves of my life, who's an amazing artist himself, living and working in Philadelphia now. Marcellus actually, at the time, was working at Studio Museum as a fundraiser, which is an equally important job. And I was like, can you help me? I really want to start this Tumblr. I posted on his Facebook wall, as you can see from this vintage post. And he said no, which is fine. You know, nothing like the friends who keep you humble. But I decided to start it anyway, because I knew it was something that I needed to see in the world. And I reached out, I think on my personal Tumblr at the time, and then to some people that I knew in person. And then I ended up with this committee of people, about 4 women actually. And Black Contemporary Art was born. And so I started a Tumblr called blackcontemporaryart.tumblr.com, which still exists. And it's interested in sharing and displaying artwork by artists of African descent on a global scale. I put this resource together, like I said, for myself really at first, and then it kind of grew into this global community. Really interested in, just making sure that people were more aware of the incredible excellence and diversity within the canon, especially in relationship to artists of African descent. When I first started it, it was just artworks, because at the time, because I wasn't learning it, I didn't think that there was any scholarship that actually existed that spoke about Black artists. It took me some years to realize and learn scholars like Dr. Kelly Jones, Dr. Sarah Lewis, Dr. Deb Willis, among others, who were doing this incredible scholarship, but I just hadn't been put on. Like, I found the images first and then the scholarship came later. And for me, I kind of found myself wedged in this middle where I was like, okay, if I have the images, I need to share the images. And so I started to build what kind of became this digital institution that people could have what was the most casual type of experience with artists of African descent. I think that there's a really unfortunate pressure that exists sometimes to go to the institution and see the work. And I don't think that there's anything quite like being in direct relationship with work. I live with art, but to be able to build that vocabulary of what you even want to see, I think is such an essential step for so many. I have so many friends who do not go to museums simply because they don't think they're smart enough. And I wanted to try to make sure that people had another resource, another entry point, to figure out where their place could be or space could be within, not necessarily the institutions, but really within this context of art and art history and popular culture, and be able to name recall artists like they're your best friends. I think that's one of the most powerful things that one can do, especially if you're really interested in it. And in the process of doing all of that, I did it largely anonymously. Like you see here, there was, we had our usernames, but like no one gave a shit, like no one cared. It was really this kind of like committee posting, 10 and 12 artworks a day, which was like so much fun at the time. Very different era of Tumblr. And I eventually graduated from Smith, and like many graduates, I was like, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I ended up in New York at an organization called Creative Time. And that was really like my aha moment, number 2, because I learned that, so I ended up at Creative Time. And that was my aha moment number 2, because Creative Time is an art organization that's really interested in social justice. And so I learned, okay, it might be important for me to continue to work at institutions that really relate to my personal morals, because it's easier for me to throw myself into my work. Like I said, I was an educator at one point, and I was being a museum educator at the Smith Museum, because we had a museum on campus, which I love my university campus museum, but it wasn't exactly aligned with everything that I wanted to be doing. And so when I got to Creative Time and was working on projects with artists like Tom Sachs or Trevor Paglen, the universe kind of just activated for me in a different way. And so and then also it was really important, especially I think relevant to this time, that Creative Time is not multimodal, but it's an art organization without brick and mortar, which means that there's not one place that all the exhibitions are shown. You might be at Domino Sugar Factory for Kara Walker, or you might be at the Park Avenue Armory, which is another art space in New York for Tom Sachs's space program. And that meant that we had to really heavily lean on social media and digital communications to wayfind, to explain, and to contextualize for our audiences, which I feel like is the most 2020 art museum quandary question. And I think for any students who are trying to figure out where to find themselves in this moment, it's so essential that you think about not, just being the most tech savvy, digital savvy, but really thinking about how this moment that has encouraged us to go online might help you invite more people into the work that you're doing, whether that's sharing more resources of scholarship or sharing more images like I was doing, or sharing exhibitions that might be open on a time ticketed basis. We all have access to those tools and can build platform around those tools. And at the very least, we all benefit from just being more aware of what's going on in the art world. I think that this industry is already one that's so siloed. And so I value so deeply any opportunity to be able to bring other people in. And Creative Time was like the crashiest course in all of that. And then aside from that, I started working on my own page because I, especially at that time, one was like so broke and just had a lot of time and energy, and found myself in the city more often than not, going to openings because there was free food, or going to openings because I wanted to see art or spend time with friends, or I'd already paid for the ticket into the city. And so I was just going to stay for the weekend because it was cheaper than going home. And in that kind of mix, I started a platform called Museum Mammy. One, because I think part of me was like, whoa, I'm working at this place, Creative Time, and I just can't believe, I kind of had like, not exactly imposter syndrome, but this very like keen awareness that I was not, like, I was very different, especially as a Black queer person, very different than the other people in this majority white art space. And then also I realized that it was important for me to maybe be a companion to others who wanted to learn more about art or find themselves in these spaces. I think one of the politics that I've continued to circle back to in my career is this kind of, what's the word, like tirade against loneliness. Like I was tired of being in rooms where I was the only Black person, or tired of being the only, Black person in a gallery space. And I think, especially to my like soft brain 22-year-old self, I was like, okay, maybe social media can be this invitation. And maybe if people know, like I was saying about Black contemporary art, if people know about the exhibitions that are on view or the artists that are on view, they might find themselves there. And what's even more interesting is that in the city of New York, we have this neighborhood called Chelsea, where there's like, 7 or 8 blocks of art galleries where you can enter for free. And so on Saturday, usually Saturday afternoons, I would start at like 10 a.m. on 27th Street and work all the way down to 17th, and share artworks with folks, so they knew what was on view. And sometimes it would be Black artists and sometimes it wouldn't. It would just be this kind of immersive experience, and my favorite details or my favorite paintings or my favorite sculptures, really trying to give people an invitation into this world that to me probably 3 years ago was completely mystifying, in the interest of making sure that it was less mystifying for others who might have an interest in it. So this is an example from later, I think this was like 2017, but I was visiting Berlin, and there's so much great stolen art in Berlin. And I was looking at this really beautiful master painting, and I found these Black figures in it. And one of my friends captured this picture of me. But I wanted to, as time evolved, it went from like, this is this exhibition that's on view, to this is what I think about this exhibition that's on view, or this is how this thing related to me, which is also a thing that we all in some way have access to. Why are you drawn to a work of art? And it doesn't just have to be, oh, because it's like by XYZ artist. It can really be, I'm really interested in the composition of this. I really like the texture of this, or I wish I could live with this. How can you use digital communications to really wayfind? Because some people might not understand the name of the artist, the context of the time and history, but they do know, okay, I like it or I don't, so there's this really incredible way that social media I found to be this really beautiful kind of middle place for those who are curious and those who are well knowledged. And then this is more some memes and cute friends. Man, okay, so then, so like anyone, I bounced around. I was going to say like any good millennial, but I know that's not every millennial's truth. I have never been at a job for more than 3 years. So that's my announcement to the group. I found myself later at a private art gallery, which was really cool, which I won't talk about for the sake of this conversation. And then I found myself working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as their social media manager. And one of the jobs that I had as part of my job at the Met was, like I said, doing this kind of work of bringing people into the institution and making available events like similar to this one, where even if people couldn't find themselves physically in the place, that they could have this really intimate connection with the artifacts and artworks that were on view in the institution. We piloted programs like Facebook 360, being able to navigate the galleries. And I know for Say It Loud, there's a Google Street View of the exhibition, which is gorgeous. Thinking about utilizing technology as it was evolving, whether that's VR or everything from like an Instagram takeover to VR, thinking about ways to innovatively bring people into an arts experience was a real cornerstone of the work that was going on there. And one of the things that really profoundly impacted me at my time at the Met was thinking about the Metropolitan Museum as this like storied institution, very famous, like so many movies about the Met. One of the best cab rides I ever had was when a taxi driver picked me up and like for 30 blocks told me about every movie that had been shot at the Met. But I think of course of Gossip Girl, because that is the post that was most emulated on the social media feeds when I was managing the account. What does it mean that these young people were sat on these steps? What does it mean that the Met Gala happens and millions of eyes are on this institution's steps every year? What does that mean if you're a person who cannot, go up steps? What does that mean if you're a person who really, really wants to go into this institution, but you don't know about the incredible accessibility offerings that this institution has? And so it kind of, into my second year at the Met, as completely fascinated with this idea of accessibility and thinking more about creative entry points into the institution, which is also ding ding, very relevant in a global health pandemic. How do you make this museum experience as safe as possible for your visitors? How do you make it such that everyone knows, okay, you have to wear a mask or you have to get a time ticket? How can you utilize communication, digital or otherwise, or signage in a way that's more accessible to communities to make sure that people are safe and as healthy as possible? And then this next slide is just because I was also in this photo with Rihanna because I used to work the Met Gala. That's completely just vanity. And one of the other things I'm really proud of from my time there was Met Signs Tours. I partnered a lot with our access team to work with our interpreters to do American Sign Language tours of the exhibitions. We also partnered with curators to do Spanish language tours, Korean language tours, literally every language that we knew a curator could speak. We're like, okay, we're putting you on Facebook Live, let's go. We want to make sure that people have as many entry points into this exhibition as possible. And that was super fun. And I think also something that's super relevant to this time. How can you activate, especially with folks who have access to the institution, multiple ways for people to get into it? And I think, especially thinking about giving this talk in relation to an exhibition like Say It Loud, there's so many ways, no matter the subject matter of an exhibition, you have to constantly be thinking about a multitude of people who might interact with an exhibition. And there should be no assumptions made. And I think in those assumptions is where we make the biggest mistakes. Say It Loud is an exhibition of African-American artists. That doesn't mean that the only people who want to go see the exhibition are African-American people. It doesn't mean that everyone who goes to see this exhibition is English speaking. How can you make sure that you're utilizing all the tools in your tool house, all of your skills as curator, as archivist, as registrar, as whatever, a student educator, to make sure that you're creating a really robust experience for anyone who's coming into the subject matter that you're working with as an institution. And then, okay, so that's just bragging. We gained like 6 million followers while I was there, which is cool. That's my selfie on my last day. And then I returned back to Dr. Woodson's quote, because I realized, after being at the Met for 3 years, that I had had a really incredible time thinking about how to bring more people into that institution. And I think for me, I was like, okay, well, what am I doing for myself? I had this really visceral reaction one day because I was walking up into the institution and looking up at the facade of the building. And I was like, this building is not going to change. There are definitely steps that I can take to change this institution. After 3 years, I probably spent my first year learning about how the museum worked, and then my last 2 figuring out new pathways to make it work in a more inclusive or more thoughtful way. But there were definitely just some things that I was like, ooh, I just feel like it might be my time to go. And I want to get back to this work of you know, the danger of being exterminated. And I made the decision to pivot from doing institutional social media work to thinking about publications, especially because I'd already had this background working on Black contemporary art. What would it mean to take some of that skill set of collecting and gathering and displaying and put it into different formats? And so I kind of broke down my life and work into these three categories. First being lectures like this one and talking to folks, because I think that for me, this is the way that I learn the best. And then second is writing. And so I've done some writing. I wrote this essay I'm really proud of for Vanity Fair this year, actually, about decolonizing museums, especially because this was like the year of museums being like, we love Black people for the first time ever. And so it was this like really difficult summer, and seeing especially previous employers where I was like, do you really? Because that was not my experience there. And so I wrote this really cool essay and had some people chime in about some of the effective changes that museums can make, which I'll drop into their chat later. And then the third, which is of course compromised by COVID in some ways, but showing up, whether that's volunteering or, you know, wayfinding. Like I often get people who tweet me or DM me, and making sure that, you know, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, or in Boise, Idaho, and I might know an exhibition that's on view, sharing that information, and really trying to think about social media and this kind of digital landscape as a true community, as opposed to just like numbers and @ and hashtags. You know, how can you think about these human to human connections and connective tissues? I think, you know, for me is the thing that's most profound. But I also realized that doing a lot of this connecting was exhausting. And there wasn't a lot of myself that was left after doing, especially lecturing. And so I got the opportunity to write my first book, which is called This Is What I Know About Art, really designed for those who are in like the 8 to 13 years old range. But I think anyone who is, you know, able to read might be interested in it. Because for me, it was an opportunity to take, you know, a lot of the things I've said in this lecture are in the book because it's just kind of like a memoir style. But it's a book that's really designed to share the story of my journey and really to talk about how important it is not only to, you know, find yourself steeped in the art world and think about making it more accessible, but also that you don't have to compromise on yourself to do it. I think all too often, especially for marginalized folks, we feel like, okay, if I'm going to be accepted by this world, I have to change my hair, or I have to talk like this, or I have to stand like this, I have to have these university credentials, and I have to study this type of thing because there are all these unspoken rules about who and how you have to be. And I made this book in the interest of dispelling some of those things, and then also making sure that for younger people, especially because of how this art world that we find ourselves in is structured, that there's an earlier kind of moment where you're like, okay, maybe I might want to work in museums, or maybe I might want to work in an artist studio. Because I know for me, it didn't happen until 2010, and I was halfway through college. Even though I was a kid who grew up in museums, I never thought, especially as a Black person, because there's not a lot of people who are going around telling Black kids you should work in museums. And so I made this book hopefully to extend that olive branch, and not just to say, oh, come work in museums, because that's definitely not how I feel. Like, I know personally that was my journey. I don't think that's everyone's, but it's really a story about encouraging young people to just follow the thing that might be precipitating for them, or might start to make the world make a little bit more sense for them. And for me, that just so happened to be art and working in museums. And then broader than that, what's today? December something. So 2 weeks ago-ish, a book that I co-edited and co-wrote with Jenna Wortham called Black Futures came out. And we started conceptualizing this book back in 2015. And we came together really because we knew that there was so much incredible there's so many incredible things that were happening in relationship to Black art and Black culture. You see, like, I don't know if any of you watch Empire. I feel like it's probably not as relevant anymore, but a show like Empire, and seeing Toyi and Oji Oditolo's work on there, or seeing Tina Knowles Lawson sharing artworks, or Beyonce referencing artworks. There is this really, like, the the barrier to some of those like enclaves of art was coming down. And then there were these incredible ways that people were connecting over social media, whether that be Black Lives Matter starting as a Facebook post and then becoming this global movement. And Jen and I came together because we were like, oh, we need to make something that will retain for future generations this moment of connectivity. And then we wound up with this book, which just came out, which is so wild because we've been working on it for 5 years. And I probably explained it really poorly, but we're at the tail end of a 2-week book tour. So my brain is just like mush on it. But it's something that I'm really excited about. And I think is so essential, especially when thinking about, you know, the potential for erasure, extermination. It's so, so, so critical that no matter your walk of life, that you take the time to take yourself seriously and wonder out loud or you know, to yourself, what kind of things do I want to leave? What kind of things do I want to preserve? If there's an exhibition like Say It Loud, what absolutely has to be in it? And so for us in Black Futures, we, you know, this book became a manifestation of some of those things. And we ended up getting just under 200 contributors. The book is like 520 something pages, which is wild. But it was such a beautiful journey and something that I'm really happy about, especially having come from this institutional world and being able to make a contribution to the canon and the ways that Black artists are studied. And so that is my talk. I don't know where my mouse is now. There we go.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I know it's nice to hear some inspiring words, especially during this crazy year. I don't see anything in the chat window just yet, so we'll give people a minute, but I highly encourage you to type in your question. But I'll go ahead and kick it off since I got the Denison copy today. Just a fun question. Who is an artist or group you personally would love to work with or feature?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel I'll cheat because I think contemporary answers are hard. I feel like if there was an art group that I could work with or just like time travel and enter the fold with, it would be the Afrocobra group that was working out of Chicago, which I can put in a link in the chat because they're under recognized, but really, really important. But I would love to be a fly on that wall.
Indeed. And another kind of follow-up, because this has just been such a year. I'm really curious to hear from you, someone who is online a lot. Can you tell us about, I know there are many, but one project that has come out of this past year in response perhaps to things that are happening socially or politically that maybe we should know about or take note of?
Yeah, absolutely. Projects that people should be aware about now, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I will, yes, one that I really love, there's an artist based in Los Angeles called Lauren Halsey, who is in Black Futures, which we're very fortunate to have Lauren's work. But Lauren is like builds these gorgeous installations and paintings. And when COVID hit, decided to start a food bank in the Crenshaw area of Los Angeles. And recently, actually like in the last month or two, made it into a nonprofit. And so I'll drop that into the chat as well, but it's called Summa Everything, and they do free food boxes for the community. And Lauren largely pays for it out of her own pocket. But between that and then, of course, there's a curator based in Philadelphia called Meg Only, who was doing this really cool, like there was so many print sales over the summer. One of which was run by Meg Only at the ICA Philly for the Philly Bail Fund. And so Meg is an incredible curator to watch and always, always, always hip to something really cool. Yeah, those are the two examples.
Okay, wonderful. I know apparently you got a big thumbs up on Afrocobra. Yeah. We have someone listening in from Chicago. Amazing, amazing. And I do want to give a shout out to those people who are listening in. I know we have some recent alums who are writers themselves, as well as some local Columbus-based artists. So I'm glad you could join us. Oh, we do have a question. So what would you say to BIPOC museum workers right now. I fortunately left my job at a major museum last year for a better fit corner of the art world, but found out 106 of my former colleagues were furloughed last week after major layoffs earlier this year. Anything to offer us hope or other directions?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, no. I think that this is a moment of crisis. Like, I wish I had more flowery language, but I think the truth of the matter is that people are losing their jobs, and there's so many pivots that are being made. But I think for for me, I'm really thankful in this moment that I'm existing in similarly, Sarah, to what you were saying. I found myself in a corner of the art world that feels better, because there's nothing like being in a, in an institution that doesn't work for you in the ways that you need it to, on top of like job insecurity. I worked in very, very many chaotic and just awful work environments. And so I feel really thankful right now that I'm not working in that space anymore. But yeah, I don't have, I mean, I would be lying to say, here's the silver lining in this. I think the reality is that a lot of our institutions are just so hardly hit right now. And the path forward is one that I think we will see, especially from the foundations, hopefully more support. I know that there was a United Artists Foundation put together alongside a few other funding organizations, an artist relief package that went out and has been kind of routinely been delivering non-discretionary funds to artists. But on an institutional level, oh my goodness, I don't even know. I mean, it was wild to see former coworkers from the Met doing mutual aid, where it's like the Met has so much money and gets these huge grants. And so, yeah, I sit next to you in kind of trying to look for hope in this moment.
And then our next question comes from Hedy Fischer. So, big plug here. If you have not heard of 22 London, you need to visit it because their show, High Anxiety, right now is amazing. And it is how we were able to bring Say It Loud to Denison. But her question is, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I think I don't know where I see myself in 5 minutes. This morning, I was emailing with Megan because I had to get a root canal last minute. So it's really minute by minute over here. But I do hope, on a broad level, that when we do get the resources and the infrastructure to get back to being able to sustain audiences and programming and exhibition in the way that I think people hope for when they think about the art world. I hope that we just see better behavior, more inclusivity, and more innovation in terms of how things are displayed, especially in relationship to accessibility. On a personal note, I have absolutely no clue. But in general, I'm hopeful that as we, continue to rebuild, and figure out where we're at, that the ones that are left or the ones that survive this moment are doing the absolute best work.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully with publications like yours that I think are really able to bring together and talk about, as you kind of say, this wayfinding and this meshing and this coming together, I'm hoping people can see in 2022 and 2021 that maybe we don't just have to be in New York and that there are ways we can bridge in on the digital spectrum and outside of our four box walls, perhaps in a better dynamic way. The next question is from Marty Hilliard. Do you anticipate that art institutions, artists, curators will continue to be available in these unique online ways? My hope is that even as COVID-19 measures transition, we will still have opportunities to connect like this from afar.
Yeah, I hope so. That was one of the things I was trying to get to in my talk, but I think I'm really hopeful. I'm really hopeful that this is the moment. I mean, I think anyone who's on, who has worked doing like digital communications has had that moment where it's like, who cares about what you do? And I think this, 2020 in the early moments, especially, I was like, ha, like, and now you guys know why I spent so many hours on tweets and posts. not for the vanity of it, or not because social media is fun, because it's not, but really because I wanted to make sure that people from all over had access to not only, what was on view, but the ideas, and how to, especially like thinking about being in a larger network of museums. Like, for example, I showed the multi-language tours on Facebook Live. I was like, as soon as we started doing them, I went to a Facebook group of international museum social media managers, and I was like, here's how we did it. Like, we used this tool to hold the phone, and we asked curators if they could do this. We recorded for this long because, we can all kind of learn from each other, and it was a very low cost initiative. And so I hope that, we'll continue to see unique and in very much online ways for people to engage. Because I think it might be like my millennial goggles, but I really firmly believe that there is something that especially digital media and communication is able to do in terms of providing an invitation that I think we just need to exhaust before we completely count out. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we did press releases for so long. Like, do press releases even work? Like, no.
They're still required in institutes of higher learning. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so we got to thank you for that response. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I know even in the past year here at Denison, a lot of things have even changed. We're a very small institution. We're a staff of 2. So you've met half the museum right now. Yeah. So I do front of house, and my colleague does back of house, but we are now connected to the Eisner Center for the Performing Arts. And that has been a real game changer. I think I was lucky enough to grow up and be familiar with all the arts. But having the opportunity to work with faculty and creative colleagues like Ojea Banks and her dance class who came in, and her students were performing in front of works of art in a dance capacity, but in front of these amazing works of art, it just makes you think differently. Or bringing in, they brought in for a music concert Daniel Bernard Roumain, who's this amazing violinist. And he brought in a bunch of his colleagues, and they were doing improv in front of all the works. And it makes you think differently and give different perspectives. And I know something I really appreciated about your recent book is that it's not just visual artists. It's that it really is kind of covering the spectrum. And I don't think, especially in art histories and sometimes museums, it's a painting, it's a sculpture, it's a photograph, it's a print. And unfortunately, I think it gets siloed a lot of times. So it was really nice seeing that.
Yeah, I think in general, we have this really bad habit, and I think everyone does it. So I say we in the most like broad sense of really siloing culture and thinking about art as this like too precious to touch kind of thing. And in the book, I know Jenna and I were both really keen on creating a really equal hierarchy for things. So there's tweets in the book, there's Facebook posts in the book, there's paintings by Nina Chanel Abney and Carrie James Marshall, and all those things should be retained and be preserved for future generations. And I think for us, we just really wanted to nail that idea home, because the book is really kind of like a blueprint, or designed like a blueprint for folks. Not just to say like, oh, our definition of these things that are worth cataloging are the definition, but really to say, this is what happens when 2 friends get together and think about the future and what we want to offer. And in the book, we have different sections, one of which is how to build your own collection of art. There's a recipe. So we have like these recipes. There's a recipe by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's incredible, and is the author of both Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism. And we excerpt from Pleasure Activism, and it's this essay about loving yourself naked. And so there's all these different like ways to both appreciate yourself and appreciate culture, and think about cataloging and saving and keeping precious things, because that's something that's just, I think, so essential.
And then we do have another question from Kat Sheridan. When working to dismantle the perceived and real barriers to arts, art institution, and community ownership of the arts as culture, who do you believe are doing phenomenal jobs pushing forward, in addition to you, of course?
Oh, that's a good question. Community arts. I feel like it's so hard to say community arts in 2020 because it's just looks so different right now. I think about and I also, of course, like have largely New York examples, which I don't know if are useful here. But one organization that I really love is an organization called the Laundromat Project that is based in New York and I think New Orleans and Nairobi. And they're really interested in like, they'll do something in a neighborhood in Brooklyn and they utilize artists who either live or are native to that neighborhood. And so it's this really concentrated kind of like, what does it mean to come see something that's by your neighbor? And this artist is planning to be a part of this community and really live and work and support this small business and that small business. And this art installation becomes a part of the community's fabric and cloth, as opposed to the ways that sometimes museums can be like, oh, it's just, here's vases, and like that doesn't exactly relate to the neighborhood. I'm trying to think what else in terms of barriers. I'd have to think more about that. I mean, there's so many barriers, and there's so many people who are dismantling them, but my brain is blanking right now.
Well, here's another question from an anonymous question. At a time when institutions are more vocal about wanting more Black voices in the space, how do you grapple with the demand to perform Blackness, often a form of respectable, non-disruptive Blackness, and speak back to institutions that generally do not show care for Black communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult one. I popped in the chat this essay that I wrote for Vanity Fair about museums because I was just kind of like taken aback, especially in May, June, seeing institutions that, have this very like lackadaisical interest in Black life, talking about how much they value, Black lives. And I think, how do we grapple? I think it's just holding that fear and holding that tension. I think I say fear first because I think it was scary in some ways to see that pivot as kind of like a marketing device. And I think for especially constituents, that doesn't mean, okay, let's boycott the Whitney Museum or let's boycott this institution. It means let's really invest in this institution. Let's see what exhibitions they have on, and let's continue to write emails or write open letters demanding that they think more inclusively about their collections and the way that they're displaying them. And I think in relationship to respectable and non-disruptive, I feel like to each their own and how you define that. I feel like I feel like I think that those kind of determinations like assemble around a sense of normal or like singular Blackness that I don't agree with. But I think, like I said, if there's a way that you don't feel represented or you don't feel like this institution that you trust in some ways is showing up in the ways that you really want or need it to, I think, either writing open letters or emailing or shouting them out on social media is always a good tool, or writing, journalism like I did. That's always super important, or writing critiques of exhibitions.
Well, I think we're pretty much at time, and I don't see any more questions. But I did want to thank you again so much for your time this evening, especially with your busy 2-week book launch. But what a wonderful way, like as I started off with being able to close our phenomenal exhibition, Say It Loud. We've been so lucky, and it has just been amazing how our community has reacted, gotten involved, and integrated with the work. And we were completely inspired by it. So if anyone else has questions, I hope you'll reach out to the Denison Museum or to Kimberly Drew online. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you all so much. Take care and be well.